Hello, wonderful bio students, and welcome to our podcast or video lecture on succession. Besides giving claim to the totally awesome success kid, which he's just like really hilarious and adorable, um, let's take a step back and look at succession in just a general context. All right, succession is a natural process of following an order or sequence. So, specific steps that you would take to arise at a specific location or a specific um, place in your life or a specific goal. So, we're going to take in the biology context, succession has to do with ecological communities. So, kind of the idea of how do we start these ecological communities? We may walk through a forest and go, wow, this is a beautiful forest. The trees are huge and they're so tall and majestic. But how did it start? How did this forest start? And what were the steps that it took to get there? And actually, this is very predictable. We see it because it happens on a pretty short time scale, things that can be observable and things that we have record of. So let's dive right in, shall we? So my question to you, let me give you a scenario, all right? A new volcanic island formed, kind of like Hawaii, right? So an island that was formed by lava pouring out of the crust, the Earth's crust, and created this awesome rocky volcanic rock island, right? And we know that plants don't come along with that magma. So we have this bare rock that's exposed. And my question to you guys is, how do we get from bare rock, what Hawaii once was, to this community, this plant community, plant and animal community? So how do we get from this point A to this point B? Well, it actually follows a pretty set steps of succession, and that is what we're going to talk about. So let's see here. First, we need what's called a pioneer species. We have a bare rock, and a pioneer species is usually a small plant or lichen. So pioneer species. And by pioneer, it means just the first species, plant or lichen species, to be able to survive. And actually, rocky conditions are very nutrient poor, and it's a very barren area. So this species was able to travel from some neighboring island by wind or by bird or by plane or by Superman, somehow gets to this volcanic island, which is barren and nutrient poor, and is able to survive in those conditions. Lichen, remember Allie the algae and Freddy the fungi make up a lichen. So lichen is a really typical pioneer species. They grow on rocks, and because it's a symbiotic relationship, it's mutualism, they help each other survive in these harsh conditions. And what they end up doing is they do a few things. They break down the rock. So their existence on the rock actually can physically break it down just by their metabolism and their existence. And it also adds nutrients. Oops, that's an A. There we go. Adds nutrients to an ecosystem that formerly didn't have any sort of biotic component. It was just rock. So this is sometimes called bare rock succession, or primary succession. And this is the succession to an ecosystem when you start, which is bare rocks, like a volcanic island, just like Hawaii. So let's look a little deeper at this. So this is a picture of primary succession. Oh dear, where am I? picture of primary succession. And we start, this is called the pioneer stage. In the pioneer stage, we start with just bare rocks. The pioneer species, such as lichens, they start establishing themselves and they create an environment for other plant species to come and more plant species to come, and sometimes even small animal species like insects that can survive on those plants. And all the while, these new plant species and these lichens are adding nutrients to the environment. They're taking carbon and nitrogen from the atmosphere and they're putting it into the ground and creating a soil. They're breaking down the rock and creating a soil. So animal species are attracted to this new plant life, and they too contribute, poo, because their waste also gives nutrients back into the system. So all the while, you could see this little soil layer. We're breaking down these rocks and we're building this soil layer that can hold nutrients enough to support an ecosystem. So after we get the pioneer stage, we have some annual plants, lichens, then we move into perennial. So annual just means that these plants grow once. They're basically, they germinate in the spring and they die in the winter. And their whole life is just 1 year, so annual. Perennial means that they live all year round and they stay established as a plant as they go through their life cycles. Excuse me. So this is the pioneer stage. Once we're kind of have established a nice soil bed, we have a lot of nutrients in the system, we get into the intermediate stage, and this is when we start seeing grasses, shrubs, and it says shade-tolerant trees. Well, when you think about it, if you're going to start to get trees, they're going to be kind of huddled together, so they're going to be competing for sunlight. So when we talk about shade-tolerant trees, they're trees that are able to live close to each other. And typically what we see in this intermediate stages are pine-type trees. So these are soft woods. They're quick growing. And they are part of the intermediate stage of primary succession. And then what happens is, over time, a climax community is reached. And this is an important thing to understand. So a climax community is usually indicative of hardwoods, very shade-tolerant trees. Typically the trees are deciduous, they're not evergreen. And our climax community is at a steady state. All of these steps going from the pioneer stage to the intermediate stage have led to this climax community, and it's stable. It's in equilibrium. And this is the end result. This is the final step of our primary succession. Now, I would like to take a look at secondary succession. Secondary succession can follow along the same path. However, this would be our former climax community. Okay, so we have a climax community. And secondary succession is something that we see all the time. In fact, if you're driving to San Luis Obispo, and just before you head on the grade, to the east was all burned. Gosh, that would have been maybe 15 to 18, somewhere in that range years ago. And that was all burned. And now you can't tell, really, because it has experienced these steps of succession to be able to replenish itself. And the thing with secondary succession is it happens faster. If you noticed on our last slide, primary succession is on a scale of about 100 years, hundreds of years. It's not millions of years or thousands of years, kind of like what we talk about in evolution, and it's very short when we look at geologic scale. But secondary succession is even quicker, and the reason why is because you already have the bare rock broken down into soil, and even though that soil may have been burned by some sort of natural disaster, it's still there, and we don't have to have that delay time of creating a soil bed for our plants to be able to grow its roots into. So secondary succession is just that. It's when a climax community becomes disrupted, like by a fire, and it's different than primary succession because there's already soil. So succession to a climax community can occur much more quickly. Pardon my English. So we follow the same steps. We've got annual plants. We kind of skip the moss lichen stage because we don't really have rocks. It's already soil. We have annual plants. They move into grasses and perennials. Then we get shrubs, pines, young oak and hickory. These are those shade tolerant trees. And then we get mature oak and hickory forests at the very end of our climax community. The other type of succession I'd like to talk about is pond succession. This is pond succession. And pond succession is just that. It's actually taking a pond, which you might see in the alpine forest, like a lake or a small pond, and the final result, the climax community, is typically a meadow or just a continuation of the forest. So what happens is we have our little story of our pond. So we have an open water lake or a pond here, and there's fish in the lake and little plants in the lake, and they're swimming along, and fish poo, right? And plants die. And so when fish get rid of their waste and plants die, where do they go? They go to the bottom of the lake. And so we start to get this little debris layer at the bottom of the lake, which is essentially contributing nutrients to the bottom of the lake. So once we get this debris, then plants can start to grow at the bottom of the lake because they have nutrients that can sustain them. So then we get plants growing on top of that, and those plants die, and fish continue to poo, and more plants continue to die, and it builds up, and so we get this nice thick layer of debris. Well, eventually this area, and you can see this kind of region right here and right here, can fill up and turn into a marsh. Now, marsh is kind of characteristic of soggy ground. Specific types of plants live there that can handle being either totally dry or being totally wet. So we get the marsh, and the marsh plants continue to grow and die, and all the while we have fish pooping and dying, and we have plants growing and dying, and it's getting this, I know it's hard to see, but it's saying accumulating sediments. So these sediments accumulate on the floor of the lake or the pond, and they make the pond more and more shallow until at the very end we have a filled lake basin, and we have grasses and shrubs, and sometimes there might be a little swamp left in the middle. This is swampy center. So basically you have this really amazingly nutrient rich, because all of this was built from dead plants, dead fish, fish waste, etc. And a lot of times if you're in a forest and you come upon a meadow, it used to be a pond. So I have some pretty pictures here. So this is varying stages of pond succession. This is, I don't know if any of you have been there, but this is Tuolumne Meadows right here. Just put a TM. That's in Yosemite. So this is a pond, and you can see that it's kind of clear, and we see a little bit of rocks there, but actually if you've been there, you see that around the edges there's a lot of plant growth. And depending on the time of year, it can be really marshy. So this is probably in that intermediate stage of succession where the pond is getting more and more shallow and the edges are getting kind of marshy. And then in the end, this is actually a picture of property that my family used to own in Idaho. And this is, we had a little meadow. And this is a former pond. We can tell because of the soil was really, really nutrient rich. And this was a former pond, and now it's all filled in with grasses, and eventually it too, this area will experience succession, and over time will we'll see nice little trees. Ta-da! So these are some examples of different stages of pond succession. Oh my gosh, we're all the way at the end. In review, we talked about primary succession as being from bare rock. And in order for a succession to get kick-started, we need a pioneer species, which is typically a lichen. And that lichen breaks down the rock and adds nutrients to the system. And then these natural steps of succession occur where you get grasses moving in. We move from annuals to perennials to shrubs to pine trees, more conifer types, and then we get into our shade-tolerant hardwood trees. And once we get to the shade-tolerant hardwood trees, we're at a climax community. And this climax community is in equilibrium. It is happy. It has reached its final point of succession. And if all goes well, it's going to stay there. But sometimes things don't go as planned, right? And we have some sort of disaster, like, okay, what if it gets logged or there's a forest fire? Then an ecosystem will experience secondary succession. And this is really similar to primary succession, except for the soil is already there because the rocks have already been broken down. And we're basically starting from step one in succession, but we have soil. So we kind of skip that whole phase when we're trying to break down rock and add nutrients to soil, and immediately we get grasses and shrubs, and this happens on a much more quick time scale. There's actually specific species of plants and bushes that are designed, they have adapted to grow back after a fire. So they are essentially the pioneer species of secondary succession. There's this flower called the fire poppy, and we have it in California. I actually saw on the grade, gosh, I don't remember when that was, but on the grade there was a fire, and the entire hillside several months later was covered in these poppies that nobody had ever seen. And basically these poppies only germinate when there's a fire. They need a fire for their seed to germinate, and they're the first plants to grow back in that secondary succession sequence. And then we also took a look at pond succession, and that's a succession of the steps that a pond takes to grow up and become a meadow and eventually become part of the rest of the forest that it is within. And with that, I hope you enjoyed our AP Bio video on succession, and I hope you have a great day.